Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking something that has completely baffled fans, frustrated coaches, and literally exhausted world-class athletes for decades. We're looking at exactly why elite soccer teams just collapse when they're forced to play high up in the mountains. It's such a fascinating mystery, right? Like, if you've ever watched a match in La Paz, Bolivia, which sits at over 3,600 meters above sea level, you've definitely noticed it. The visiting squad just looks incredibly sluggish, they're misjudging passes, gasping for air. Or think back to the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. Players were constantly complaining that the ball was flying erratically and totally ignoring their commands. So, what's actually going on out there on the pitch?
Well, to get to the bottom of this, here is our agenda. We'll start with part 1, looking at the ball and its physics. Then part 2, the body and its physiology. And finally, part 3, the playbook, covering tactics and acclimatization.
Okay, part 1, the ball. Let's look at aerodynamics and the physics of thinner air. So when a soccer ball is moving through the air, it's basically governed by 3 primary forces. First, you've got gravity, which is obviously pulling it down to the turf. Then you have drag, which is the air resistance pushing against the ball, slowing it down. And lastly, you have the Magnus force, or lift, and that's the aerodynamic force that gives a spinning ball its curve. Now, here's where it gets interesting. As you go up in altitude, barometric pressure drops, meaning the air density significantly decreases. Because the air is thinner, aerodynamic drag actually drops by about 10%. Honestly, it's basically the difference between kicking a ball through a thick pool of water at sea level versus playing a match in the thin, frictionless atmosphere of the moon. So what does this actually mean for the players? Well, because of this reduced drag, the ball just keeps going. A long pass or a goal kick is going to travel roughly 2 to 2.5 meters further for every 1,000 meters of elevation gained. This easily leads to overshot passes. Outfield players routinely send the ball flying past their target simply because their muscle memory is calibrated for the thicker, slower air at sea level. Imagine trying to thread a delicate pass to a teammate and you accidentally launch it into the third row. But what about the curve? We all love seeing those beautiful bending free kicks. That curve is controlled by the Magnus effect. When a ball spins, it creates a pressure imbalance. High pressure on one side, low pressure on the other. This pushes the ball, bending its path right into the net. But there's a catch. The Magnus effect absolutely relies on dense air to create those pressure differentials. And this is crucial. Thinner air weakens this effect by up to 30%. Normally, a bending free kick relies on this sudden transition late in its flight, dropping into a high drag zone where it rapidly slows down and bites hard into a curve. At high altitude, that just doesn't happen. The ball doesn't slow down enough, the lateral force is severely weakened, and instead of dipping beautifully over the defensive wall, it just sails flat and straight into the stands. This lack of drag and spin control is exactly why so many players and coaches complained about the 2010 World Cup ball. The Jabulani ball was already designed with very smooth seams. So when you combined that super smooth design with the 1,800-meter altitude of Johannesburg, the ball's aerodynamics were just thrown into absolute chaos. It behaved oddly, it wobbled, and it created a total nightmare scenario for goalkeepers trying to read its trajectory. All right, moving on to part 2, the body, focusing on hypoxia and player physiology. We're shifting from the external physics of the ball to the internal biology of the player. Because obviously, the ball isn't the only thing affected by the thin air. While mountain air actually still contains the exact same 21% concentration of oxygen as it does at sea level, the lower barometric pressure means those oxygen molecules are spread much further apart. Because of this, there's severely reduced pressure driving oxygen from the lungs into the bloodstream. This physiological state is known as hypoxia. And hypoxia has a devastating impact on a player's VO2 max, which is the maximum volume of oxygen a player can consume and use for energy during intense exercise. Get this, for every 1,000 meters of elevation gained, a player's VO2 max drops by roughly 7%. So, at an altitude of 3,600 meters, an unacclimatized player instantly loses around 20 to 24% of their aerobic engine, just gone. Over a grueling 90-minute match, this triggers a brutal internal chain reaction. To compensate for the lack of oxygen, resting and active heart rates spike immediately, muscles fail to reoxygenate, and crucially, there's a delayed resynthesis of phosphocreatine, which is what muscles use for quick explosive bursts. This means players completely lose their ability to recover between high-intensity sprints. They hit their anaerobic red zone incredibly fast. And it's not just the muscles that suffer. The brain takes a massive hit too. Cognitive decision-making is up to 15% more efficient at sea level than it is at 3,000 meters. This lack of oxygen to the brain leads to mental sluggishness, impaired spatial awareness, and significantly slower reaction times. This is exactly why you'll see even the world's best, most technically gifted athletes making uncharacteristic mental errors and really sloppy passes late in the game. Oxygen availability plummets incredibly rapidly as you ascend. At 3,000 meters, players are operating with just 70% of the oxygen pressure they're used to. Because of this steep decline, the data shows players cover significantly less ground, and coaches are forced to make much earlier substitutions just to prevent total physical collapse on the field. Which brings us to part 3, the playbook, covering tactics and acclimatization. So if the ball won't curve and your players can't breathe, how do you actually win? Well, tactically, managers have to adapt completely. Teams basically have to abandon aggressive, high-intensity pressing tactics, like the famous gegenpressing, because the sprint fatigue is just too severe. The players literally cannot recover fast enough to maintain the pressure. Instead, they have to opt for a compact, sit-deep defense, like a low block. And offensively, they rely heavily on long-range shots from outside the box to exploit the fact that the ball travels faster and straighter due to the lower aerodynamic drag. Off the pitch, preparation is absolutely everything. When time is short, sports scientists use what's called the arrive and play protocol. It's kind of like a smash and grab heist. The goal is to rush the team into the high-altitude stadium under 18 hours before kickoff, ideally within just 6 hours. The physiological trick here is to play the match and get out before the most severe symptoms of acute mountain sickness, sleep disruption, and dehydration fully set in, which usually peak around 48 to 72 hours. On the other hand, if a team has weeks to prepare, they'll implement a much more thorough, live-high, train-low strategy. Players live and sleep at altitude to force their bodies to naturally boost red blood cell production, which improves oxygen transport. But they travel to lower elevations for actual training sessions so they can maintain their top speed and workout intensity. All of this is heavily supported by iron supplementation, ensuring the bone marrow has the fuel it needs to build those new red blood cells. Which leaves us with a really fascinating final thought. We've seen how profoundly a few thousand meters of elevation warps both the aerodynamic physics of the soccer ball and the internal biology of the athlete. It literally alters the tactics required to win. So, considering all of this, should the global rules of the game be adjusted? Should future tournaments mandate standardized altitude-adjusted ball aerodynamics to truly level the playing field? It's a question that sits right at the intersection of sports, science, and fairness. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it gave you a whole new perspective on the beautiful game.